Emily Carter was 29 when people around Red Creek, eastern Oklahoma, decided her story was already over. 6 months earlier, she had buried her husband, Luke. Since then, she had been living alone on the struggling cattle ranch he had inherited from his grandfather. Most of the neighbors believed it was only a matter of time before she sold the place. Keeping a ranch alive was hard enough for an experienced rancher. A young widow had little chance, or so they thought. But Emily did something nobody expected. Instead of fixing the broken cedar fences that leaned across the pastures, she started collecting the old fence posts people had thrown aside. She drove from ranch to ranch with a weathered flatbed trailer, asking if she could take the cracked, rotting posts stacked beside barns or waiting to be burned. Most ranchers gladly gave them away. Then they laughed. One old cowboy grinned and said she must be building the longest fence in Oklahoma. Another shook his head and whispered that losing Luke had changed her. Even Emily's father-in-law asked what she planned to do with all that old wood. Emily only smiled. She never gave anyone an answer. Every evening she hauled another load home and stacked the worn cedar posts behind an abandoned pasture where nobody could see what she was planning. Week after week, the pile grew taller, while the questions grew louder. By late September, the same ranchers who had laughed would be driving to Emily's ranch before sunrise. Not to make jokes, but to stand in silence and ask one simple question: what did you do? They were about to discover that the oldest pieces of her ranch held the secret everyone else had been throwing away. If stories about hard work, family, and second chances mean something to you, subscribe and join us for more every week. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to know how far this story has reached. The Carter Ranch rested on the rolling prairie of eastern Oklahoma, where red dirt stained every pair of work boots and dry winds swept across open fields for miles. In summer, the small creeks shrank until they were little more than narrow ribbons of muddy water. The old cedar fences had stood for decades, built long before Emily was born, when Luke's grandfather first carved a living from the land. Time had bent many of those posts, and every year, a few more gave way to weather and age. Luke had always believed the ranch would stay in the family. After he passed away, friends told Emily she should sell before the bills became too much. Feed prices kept climbing, the pastures grew thinner every year, and many nearby ranches were running fewer cattle than they had a decade before. Still, Emily stayed. She believed Luke had seen something worth fighting for. Inside the farmhouse, tucked away on a dusty shelf, she found Luke's grandfather's old ranch journals. Their pages were filled with hand-drawn maps, careful notes in faded pencil, and small sketches written in the margins. Most people would have called them old papers. Emily read every page. She noticed things other ranchers rarely stopped to watch. She studied the way the wind crossed each pasture, where the shade stayed longest in the afternoon, how the soil held moisture after a storm, where the grass recovered first, how rainwater traveled downhill, and why some fence lines stayed greener than the fields around them. Every ranch in the county faced the same problems: dry pasture, poor grazing, soil washing away after heavy rain, higher feed costs every year. Most folks blamed the drought and believed nothing could change it. Emily wasn't so sure. The idea did not come to Emily all at once. It began with something so small that almost everyone else would have walked right past it. One hot afternoon, after nearly 3 weeks without rain, she rode her old ranch truck across the north pasture to check a broken water trough. The grass was dry and brittle. Every step sent little clouds of red dust into the air. The cattle had eaten most of what little green remained, and the ground looked tired from another long Oklahoma summer. But then Emily noticed something strange. Along an old cedar fence that had fallen years before, the grass was different. It wasn't thick enough to catch anyone's eye from a distance, but standing beside it, she could see the change clearly. The blades were taller. They were softer under her boots. More important, they were still green. She walked the length of the broken fence line. 20 feet farther, the pasture returned to its usual dry brown color. She stopped. Then she turned around and walked back again. The green grass followed the old cedar posts almost like a path. Over the next several days, Emily visited every worn-out fence line on the ranch. She carried a small notebook from Luke's grandfather and wrote down everything she saw. Some fence lines held moisture longer after a light rain. Others seemed to slow the water running downhill. In a few places, Wildflowers still bloomed where the rest of the pasture had already dried out. She didn't tell anyone. Instead, she kept watching. Early each morning, before the heat settled over the prairie, she walked the same paths. She knelt to touch the soil with her fingers. She watched where the morning shade stayed longest. She followed tiny streams of rainwater after brief summer storms. Little by little, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The oldest cedar fence posts were doing more than marking property lines. Around them, the ground stayed cooler. The soil held together better. The wind seemed weaker. Even after years of neglect, life clung to those narrow strips of land. Emily began wondering what would happen if those old cedar posts were placed where the ranch needed them most. It sounded too simple, maybe even foolish, which explained why nobody else had ever tried it. As the thought settled deeper into her mind, Emily looked across the dry pasture one more time. Maybe the fence posts weren't protecting cattle anymore. Maybe they had been protecting something else all along. The next Saturday, Emily hitched her old flatbed trailer to Luke's pickup and drove to the Wilson Ranch a few miles down the road. Behind the main barn sat a pile of broken cedar fence posts. Some had split down the middle. Others were bent, cracked, or worn smooth after years of standing in the Oklahoma sun. Most people saw firewood. Emily saw something worth taking home. She found Mr. Wilson repairing a gate and asked if she could have the old posts. He looked at the pile, then back at her. "You sure you want this old junk?" Emily smiled. "If you're not using it, I'd be happy to haul it away." He shrugged. "Take every piece." As she loaded the trailer, another rancher pulled into the yard. He watched for a moment before laughing. "Planning to build another ranch out of scrap wood?" Emily laughed softly with him but never answered. By the end of the week, she had visited 4 more ranches. Everywhere she went, people gave her the same puzzled look. Some offered to help load the trailer. Others shook their heads. A few whispered after she drove away. Word spread quickly through the county. The young widow was collecting broken fence posts. Nobody knew why. Even her father-in-law couldn't make sense of it. One evening, he stood beside the growing stack behind the old pasture and rested his hand on one of the weathered posts. "Emily," he said gently, "if you've got a plan, I'd sure like to hear it." She brushed the dust from her gloves and looked across the dry grass. "I need a little more time." "Time for what?" She smiled. "To make sure I'm seeing it right." That was all she said. The pile grew larger with every passing day. Long cedar posts, short broken pieces, crooked rails, even old corner posts that had once held the strongest fences on nearby ranches. Emily sorted each one into neat stacks, as if every piece already had a place. People driving past slowed down to stare. Some guessed she was rebuilding every fence on the ranch. Others thought she planned to sell the cedar as reclaimed wood. Nobody came close to the truth. Emily wasn't collecting the posts to hold cattle. She wasn't planning to build fences at all. Every evening she carried another load toward the abandoned pasture, measuring the ground with quiet care, stopping often to study the shape of the land before placing each post exactly where she wanted it. She still hadn't explained herself, and with every trailer she unloaded, the mystery only grew deeper. By the middle of August, almost everyone in Red Creek had heard about Emily Carter and her trailer full of broken fence posts. People began expecting to see her on the back roads. If there was an old ranch with a pile of weathered cedar waiting to be hauled away, sooner or later Emily would pull into the yard. She always asked first, "If you're done with those old posts, would you mind if I took them?" Most ranchers smiled and pointed toward the pile. "Take every one." It saved them the trouble of burning the wood or hauling it to the dump. Others couldn't help asking questions. Emily would only smile. "You'll see." That answer only made people more curious. Some joked that she was building a maze for her cattle. Others laughed that she planned to fence in the whole county. One rancher even told her, "You'll run out of land before you run out of fence posts." Emily laughed with them, loaded another trailer, and drove away without saying another word. The cedar posts were only the beginning. As she traveled from ranch to ranch, she started collecting other things people no longer wanted. Rolls of rusty fencing wire that had been left in old sheds, flat rocks gathered from cleared fields, piles of fallen branches stacked after spring storms, wheelbarrows full of dry leaves, cedar needles, and wood chips that neighbors planned to burn. To everyone else, it looked like junk. To Emily, every piece had a purpose. Back at the ranch, She sorted everything into neat piles beside the abandoned pasture. The longest cedar posts went in one row. The shorter pieces were stacked by size. The rocks were placed in careful circles. The old wire was rolled tightly and covered with a tarp to keep it dry. Even the brush and mulch were arranged as though she already knew exactly where they belonged. Her father-in-law watched quietly from the porch one evening. "I've never seen anyone work this hard without telling folks what they're working on," he said. Emily looked across the pasture, where the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows over the dry grass. "Sometimes," she said softly, "people stop looking once they think they already know the answer." He nodded, though he wasn't sure what she meant. Day after day, the piles behind the old pasture grew larger. So did the whispers around town. People knew Emily was building something. They just couldn't imagine what kind of project could need broken fence posts, old wire, loose rocks, fallen branches, and mulch all at the same time. The mystery that had started with one trailer had become the biggest conversation in the county, and Emily still hadn't explained a thing. Emily waited until the first cool morning in late August before she began. She carried the old cedar posts into the abandoned pasture, one load at a time. Instead of standing them upright like a fence, she laid them across the slope in long, gentle lines. Between the posts, she packed loose rocks, woven brush, and handfuls of natural mulch. She tied some of the larger pieces together with the old wire she had collected. Anyone watching from a distance would have thought she was making a terrible mistake. The rows didn't look like fences. They didn't look like cattle pens. They didn't look like anything most ranchers had ever built. For 2 full days, Emily worked alone. By sunset, sweat covered her face, and her gloves were stained with red Oklahoma dirt. She stepped back, looked over her work, and quietly smiled. Then the rain came. It started as a gentle shower during the night. By morning, it had turned into one of the hardest storms Red Creek had seen all summer. Emily hurried to the pasture as soon as the rain eased. Her heart sank. The rushing water had pushed rocks out of place. The brush had broken loose. Several cedar posts had rolled downhill. Parts of the structure had almost disappeared beneath mud and scattered branches. Days of work had been washed away in a single night. She stood there for a long time. Then she picked up the first fallen post. The next morning, she started again. This time, she buried the cedar posts deeper into the soil and locked the larger rocks around them. She tightened the old wire until every piece held firmly together. It looked stronger. For a few days, it was. Then one afternoon, a small group of young cattle wandered through the pasture. Curious as always, they rubbed against the cedar posts and stepped across the rows. By evening, several sections had collapsed under their weight. Emily didn't get angry. She simply watched where the cattle walked and where the structure had failed. She filled another page in Luke's grandfather's notebook. A week later, she tried for a third time. The rows stayed in place. The cattle stayed out. But something still wasn't right. After a light rain, the water moved too quickly through parts of the pasture, instead of slowing down the way she had hoped. Emily knelt beside the damp soil, running her fingers through the wet earth as she watched tiny streams slip past her work. Every failure answered one question and raised another. The people around town still had no idea what Emily was trying to build. To be honest, neither did they. They only knew one thing. She refused to give up until she got it right. Emily knew working harder would not solve the problem. She needed to understand the land better. That evening, she carried Luke's grandfather's journals to the kitchen table and read until the house grew quiet. The pages were filled with careful notes from seasons long gone. There were sketches of hills, creek beds, and old fence lines. One sentence appeared again and again in different years. "Slow the water, and the land will take care of the grass." Emily read those words 3 times. The next morning, she drove to the county library and borrowed several USDA conservation manuals. Most people would have found them dull. Emily couldn't put them down. They explained how rainwater rushed across bare ground, carrying away good soil before it could soak in. They showed simple ways to guide water instead of fighting it. Late one afternoon, Emily stopped by the ranch of Walter Briggs, an 82-year-old rancher known for keeping healthy pastures even during dry years. He had spent much of his life helping families protect their land from erosion. Walter listened as Emily described her failed attempts. When she finished, he smiled. "You've been trying to stop the water." Emily nodded. "A little." Walter picked up a stick and drew a line in the dirt. "Don't stop it," he said. "Slow it down. Give it time to sink into the ground. Water always wants to help you. You just have to stop chasing it." Those words stayed with Emily all the way home. The next morning, she walked her pasture again, but this time she looked at it differently. She no longer saw broken fence posts. She saw tools. If they were placed across the slope instead of down it, they could gently slow the rainwater. The rocks could hold the soil in place. The brush could catch leaves and small branches. The mulch could protect the ground from the hot sun. Little by little, each rainfall would leave behind moisture instead of carrying it away. The old cedar posts had never been the real answer. It was where they were placed that mattered. Emily finally understood what she had been trying to build. She wasn't building fences. She was building quiet barriers that followed the shape of the land, slowing runoff, trapping moisture, and giving tired grass another chance to grow. For the first time since she began collecting those weathered posts, every piece of the puzzle fit together. Now she only had one thing left to discover. Would the land respond the way she believed it would? Emily spent the rest of the fall rebuilding every row with fresh confidence. She placed each cedar post where the land naturally guided the water. The rocks held the soil in place. The brush caught leaves and small branches after every storm. A thick layer of mulch covered the ground between the rows, helping the earth stay cool even on warm afternoons. When winter came, there was little to see except weathered wood resting across the hillside. Some neighbors drove past and shook their heads. To them, it still looked like a strange collection of old fence posts. Emily simply waited. She knew the real test would come in the spring. By March, gentle rains began to fall across eastern Oklahoma. The water no longer rushed down the pasture like it had before. Instead, it slowed. It spread out. It soaked into the ground. Week after week, Emily walked the pasture with Luke's grandfather's notebook in her hand. Every visit brought another small surprise. The grass began growing earlier than it had the year before. Fresh green shoots appeared in places that had stayed brown for years. Soon, native grasses returned to parts of the pasture where many people believed they were gone forever. Not long after that, small patches of wildflowers appeared between the cedar rows. Emily smiled every time she found another one. By early summer, something even more remarkable happened. The little creek crossing the edge of the ranch was still flowing. Most years, it had slowed to a muddy trickle by then. This time, clear water continued moving gently over the rocks long after neighboring creeks had started drying up. The pasture stayed green for weeks longer than anyone expected. The cattle noticed before the people did. They spent more time grazing and less time searching for fresh grass. Their coats looked healthier, and they put on weight earlier than they usually did. Emily hadn't installed an expensive irrigation system. She hadn't drilled a new well. She hadn't bought costly equipment. She had simply helped the land hold on to the rain it was already receiving. One evening, as the sun settled low over the prairie, Emily climbed the small hill overlooking the ranch. From there, she could see the difference with her own eyes. Her pasture stretched across the hillside in deep shades of green. Beyond her property, many fields had already begun turning pale under the summer heat. There was no need for Emily to explain what had happened anymore. The land was telling the story for her. News traveled fast across Red Creek. It started with quiet conversations at the feed store. Then people began talking about Emily's pasture after church on Sunday. Soon, ranchers who had never paid much attention to her little project found themselves driving past her property just to take a look. At first, they stayed by the road. Then they parked their trucks. Before long, they were walking across the pasture themselves. The same men who had once laughed at her trailer full of broken fence posts now stood quietly, looking across the green hillsides. One of them bent down and picked up a handful of soil. It was dark, cool, soft enough to break apart in his fingers. He looked across the fence at his own dry pasture and slowly shook his head. "I've never seen anything like this," he said. Another rancher followed the rows of cedar posts with his eyes. "So that's what all that old wood was for." Emily smiled but said nothing. A few days later, the county conservation office called and asked if they could visit the ranch. Emily agreed. Two conservation specialists spent the morning walking the pasture with notebooks in their hands. They measured the slope of the land, checked the moisture in the soil, and studied how the cedar rows followed the shape of the hillside. One of them stopped near the creek and smiled. "The runoff is slowing exactly where it should," he said. "That's why this pasture is holding water." The following week, a local agricultural extension agent named Mark Benson came to see the ranch. He compared Emily's pasture with nearby fields that had received the same amount of rain. The difference was easy to see. Her grass was thicker, the soil had less erosion, the creek still flowed. Even the cattle looked healthier. When Mark finished writing his notes, he closed his notebook and looked at Emily. "You've done something many people spend years trying to figure out." Word spread even farther after that. The ranchers who had once joked about the longest fence in Oklahoma returned one by one. This time, nobody laughed. Instead, they asked if Emily would walk them through the pasture. She gladly did. She showed them where each cedar post was placed. She explained why the rocks mattered. She pointed to the mulch, the brush, and the way the rows followed the land instead of fighting it. When she finished, one of the oldest ranchers in the county looked at her with a smile. "Emily," he said, "would you come help us build one on my place?" Before long, that question was being asked all across the county. The young widow, everyone thought would lose her ranch, had become the person everyone wanted to learn from. The whole county wanted her secret. People often asked Emily where she got the idea. She always gave the same answer: "It wasn't really my idea." Then she would smile and point toward the pasture. "The land was trying to teach me. I just started paying attention." She never claimed to invent a new way of ranching. She never said she was smarter than anyone else. Emily believed the answers had been there for years, waiting for someone to notice them. Some of those answers came from the land itself. Others came from Luke's grandfather's old journals, filled with careful notes that many people had forgotten. Those faded pages held lessons learned over a lifetime, and Emily simply gave them another chance to be useful. By the next spring, more changes could be seen across the county. Instead of burning broken cedar fence posts, families began saving them. Old piles of weathered wood slowly disappeared from ranches. Neighbors worked together on weekends, placing cedar rows across hillsides, adding rocks, brush, and mulch just as Emily had shown them. Little by little, more pastures stayed green longer into the summer. More creeks held water after the rains. Healthier grass meant healthier cattle, and healthier cattle meant less money spent on extra feed. It all started because one young widow refused to believe that old fence posts were worthless. Emily had already started restoring another section of her ranch. This time, she wasn't working alone. Several neighbors came with shovels, gloves, and trailers. They laughed together as they worked, but it was very different from the laughter that had followed Emily just months before. Now, it was the laughter of people learning from one another. The old cedar posts were still holding the land together, but something else had changed too. They had brought a community back together. Sometimes progress does not begin with buying the newest machine or spending the most money. Sometimes it begins by seeing value in something everyone else has already thrown away. Sometimes the greatest ideas are not new at all. They are old lessons waiting for someone willing to listen. Now we'd love to hear from you. What's one farming lesson that has been passed down through your family and still works today? Share it in the comments below, and don't forget to tell us where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories about farming, family, and the quiet wisdom found in everyday life, subscribe and join us for more American Farm.